Michael Binion is here to talk us through the big foreign policy, diplomatic and defence stories. Michael, hello.
Hello. Hi.
Any tattoos?
None on me, no.
You shock me. Actually, you know what? I could have seen that going either way. I really
yes,
could. You know.
I know. I always was envious of George Shultz, former U.S. Secretary of State, who had a tiger tattooed on his bum.
Really?
Apparently.
I'm not going to ask how you knew. Let's crack on, Michael, and obviously start with Germany, where the Conservative leader Friedrich Merz is set to be the new chancellor.
Herzlichen Dank für das Vertrauen, das Sie uns und das Sie auch mir persönlich.
Well, that was the CDU's Merz thanking voters for the trust they've placed in them, and he went on to say that he knows the job ahead is not going to be easy. The other story of the night is, of course, the success of the hard-right Alternative for Germany, which went on to claim second place. Michael, for those who don't understand, who to some extent include me, explain to us precisely what happens now, what the way German governments work, the coalition building that's always required.
Yes, well, it's very unusual. In fact, I think almost never that the German constitution has delivered a majority party after an election. And so they have to then negotiate with potential partners to form a coalition, which is really a process of haggling and bargaining. And, you know, we'll agree to this, but we won't agree to that. We'll have this and we won't have that. There's one or two really difficult decisions that have to be made. The big one is whether they can change the so-called debt ceiling, that they can actually go into debt. This is because there's a huge amount needed to be spent on defence and various things. And for that, you need a two-thirds majority. And whatever he does in a coalition, he's not really going to have two-thirds of the Bundestag with him. Now, which partners he chooses is also pretty tricky. He's ruled out having the second largest party, the Alternative for Germany, which means he's probably going to have to rely on the Social Democrats, who had pretty much of a drubbing during the election, and Olaf Scholz was decisively rejected. So he's going to be looking at coalition with a party in a sorry state, and whether they're willing to go in with him. The two smaller parties he was hoping might come along, the Liberal Democrats, who always seem to be in every coalition, they only scored 4%. So they really, they didn't make the threshold. You've got to need 5% to get into Parliament. They didn't. So they're out. So he's got a bit of a job deciding who his partners will be.
And I mean, the Social Democrats, who he's most likely to go into collision with, who do they map onto in British politics?
Well, they're the sort of traditional Labour Party. I mean, right. they're sort of left, not terribly left, but because there is a party further left called the Left Party, which was really the inheritors of the old Communist Party in Eastern Germany. But the Social Democrats, they used to be a formidable party. I mean, they're the party of Willy Brandt, of Chancellor Schmidt, and they have held power on and off for quite a long time. But they're in a sorry state at the moment, and I have to say that Scholz's coalition was pretty ineffective. I mean, he had Greens and Liberal Democrats with him, and they couldn't agree on anything much.
And how big a deal is this vote for the AfD, for the AfD, which is like around about the 20% mark? 'Cause I mean, it's new territory in Germany. Well, not new territory, but returning to old territory, shall we say? But if you look across at France, you know, in the last presidential election, over 40% of people would vote for Marine Le Pen, for example. Does that mean in the second round at least? Does that mean? I mean, should the AfD be considered the equivalent of other parties on the right around Europe, or are they sort of a step further?
Well, it's all to do with history. The fact that a party on the right, and fairly far right, is creeping into power or looks at as though it's snapping at the heels of the government is very worrying for Germans because of their history and for other countries as well. They're probably slightly more to the right than many other parties. I mean, think Italy, think France. I mean, they've got parties on the right, and in Italy they're in power, and nobody's too worried. But the AfD, they do have overtones of the Third Reich. I mean, they've used language, they've used ideas that are very reminiscent.
They had a poster with salutes on it.
Yes. I mean, that is very, very dangerous, and it's playing with fire, and it's waking up old atavistic memories, which is very dangerous. The themes that they're pushing are themes that actually resound very well. I mean, they reverberate with the population, namely immigration, getting the economy going, and a certain skepticism about the whole Ukraine war. It's strange that parties on the right all over Europe seem to be more pro-Russian than parties on the left.
Yeah, in a big way. Well, look, I mean, speaking of the defense angle of things, Merz has called for step-by-step independence from the US, criticizing interference from US officials in Sunday's election, by which he means Elon Musk, of course, endorsing the AfD. And look, not long ago, it would have been unthinkable for a German chancellor to be talking about needing more independence, particularly military independence from the United States. And it would have been unthinkable even for Merz to have said that, because, of course, he was virtually an Atlanticist. What do you see ahead in this regard? Do you think is Germany going to sort of build itself into a new military powerhouse that leads Europe?
No, I don't think so. I mean, that's certainly not in keeping with general public opinion. I think Merz, I mean, he is quite a bruiser. He's a person who speaks out. He's not a consensus politician. He's very different from the last CDU politician and Chancellor Angela Merkel, who very much sought compromise and, being at the centre, and for whom the American alliance was absolutely vital. I think, yes, as you say, Merz used to be a strong Atlanticist, but I think there's a general dismay in Europe at the policies being put forward by Trump, and there's a feeling if we don't stand up to him now and speak out, we are going to be rolled over, and I don't think Germany is in a position for that. They certainly don't want it, and the whole appeal of Merz has been make Germany strong again. It's a sort of equivalent of Trump's policies. And that, if that brings him into a clash with the Americans, well, so be it. He's more or less said, well, he's more or less suggested that America is no longer Germany's friend.
Yeah, I mean, Michael, like an elephant, you never forget. Can you think of a time where the ties between Europe and America in this kind of way were anything like this?
No, I can remember strains and difficulties. One, particularly with Germany, was when the Americans wanted to deploy cruise missiles in Germany to counter Soviet SS-20 missiles, and there was a huge opposition to that, and there was a general feeling in America that the Germans had become pacifists and they couldn't be relied on, and tensions were pretty high. We're talking about the early 80s when tensions were high, but they seem to have smoothed over. I can't remember when there's been such a disconnect between not just Germany, but all of Europe and America. But Europe's waking up. They're beginning to realize that America's got other fish in the sea.
Yeah, and do you foresee a much more, if not just for Germany, a much more sort of militarized Europe? A Europe with a significantly stronger and more culturally significant military dimension?
Well, that's what Europe is calling for. The question is, have they got the money to pay for it? And it's going to be very difficult. Britain, which has always prided itself on having a pretty strong and robust army and being one of the two European countries whose military forces matter, together with France. Britain's really struggling to think how it could pay for raising defence spending at least to 2.5%, and what they could cut. And that's the same all over Europe. And I don't think Europe wants it to be itself to be a military power. And if so, are we going to have a collection of individual militarized countries, or is this going to be a pooled effort? We've already got a pooled effort in the form of NATO, which seems a bit dysfunctional at the moment.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Look, well, I've got you, Michael. Let's talk about Israel, because the US has said it's going to try and extend the current phase of the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, despite setbacks that have raised fears of a return to war. Israel delayed the expected release of Palestinian prisoners after what it called the humiliating ceremonies involving its hostages, where they've, of course, been paraded around, even sometimes in coffins, before they were released. It was said the release would not go ahead without a guarantee that the next group of captives would be freed without further acts of humiliation. What do you foresee happening? Do you think, is this the beginning of this process breaking down, do you think?
I fear so, yes. I fear that Netanyahu really doesn't have any interest in moving to stage 2, because for him that's the difficult bit, which is deciding how Gaza will be governed and what kind of settlement will be achieved. And it looks pretty clear that you cannot simply say Hamas will not be there, because they are there. And he doesn't want to move to that. He's said several times, if necessary, he's ready to return to war. Those in his cabinet, some of them, are itching for an end to this deal because they feel it's to Israel's disadvantage. And frankly, yes, the humiliation of the hostages was unpleasant and nasty, but, the release of Palestinian prisoners, this was agreed. And if you don't go ahead with what you've agreed, then it just gives the other side an excuse to go, not to keep their side of the bargain. And a lot of opinion in Israel says the priority must be to get those hostages back. There are still only a few remaining, but they must come back. Now, I think the Americans would be very angry if we don't move to stage 2. Mind you, what Trump's vision of stage 2 will be, anybody knows. I mean, could it be setting up Riviera in Gaza?
Yeah, exactly.
But I think there will be pressure to move to stage 2, but I'm a bit pessimistic about whether that really will happen.
I mean, the fact that the latest hostages released by Hamas have largely been the bodies of hostages seems to suggest that actually the number of living hostages may be nudging towards the area where Israel is thinking it's not necessarily in their interest to continue with this.
Well, sadly, yes, that's the realpolitik. That's the calculation. Of course, that would be deeply, deeply upsetting to the families of those who are still being held, even if those being held are just corpses. I mean, that would still be very upsetting. But yes, I mean, I have to say there's been a faction. Well, the two main ones have now left the Israeli coalition cabinet, but there's been a faction that said, well, let's just get on with the war and don't bother about the hostages.
Yeah, indeed. Look, Michael Binion, thanks very much indeed. Great to have you with us today. Always good to speak to you and get the benefit of your experience.